Most people assume that when Elizabeth married Philip, she simply married a handsome naval officer who happened to carry a royal title. That's true in roughly the same way that calling a hurricane a bit of weather is true. She married velocity. She married a man who could dismantle nonsense in a single sentence and rarely bothered checking whether the sentence would sting. She married someone who had learned, very young and very hard, that the safest response to a world constantly rearranging the furniture beneath him was to keep moving faster than the furniture could. He could be magnificent company and unbearable company, sometimes within the same conversation. He was brilliant enough to see straight through pretense, blunt enough to announce what he saw out loud, and so thoroughly unpractised in ordinary domestic softness that sharing a house with him could feel less like a marriage and more like keeping pace with an elegant, dangerous weather system that had decided, for reasons of its own, to settle permanently in Buckingham Palace. Welcome to Blue Blood Mysteries. It began on the Greek island of Corfu in the summer of 1921 to a family that was royal on paper and precarious in practice, which turns out to be one of the more uncomfortable combinations a child can be born into. He arrived as Prince Philip of Greece and Denmark, a title that looked splendid on an invitation and meant almost nothing in terms of actual security. He belonged to one of those tangled, intermarried European royal houses where half the continent's thrones traced back to the same handful of grandparents, where the family silver was inherited and the family's political fortunes could flip between breakfast and lunch. His father, Prince Andrew of Greece, was a younger son of the Greek royal line. Charming and brave under fire, but casual to the point of carelessness about money and permanence. His mother, Princess Alice of Battenberg, was a great-granddaughter of Queen Victoria, intelligent and strikingly beautiful, and almost completely deaf from childhood, a woman who moved through royal life with real intensity despite being unable to hear most of what that life said to her. Between them they produced a household that photographed beautifully and functioned considerably less well. Philip was the only son, arriving after 4 older sisters, and in a gentler household that position might have made him a cherished small king inside a warm, crowded nursery. In this particular household, it meant he was treasured in principle and swept along by events in practice, because the ground beneath the family gave way almost immediately. Greece in the early 1920s was no peaceful backdrop for royal photographs. It was a nation reeling from military catastrophe in Asia Minor, and the royal family, blamed for the disaster, found itself facing arrest, exile, and worse. Philip was barely more than an infant when his father was seized, court-martialed, and banished from the country, and so before the boy could form a single memory of the island where he was born, he was carried away from it entirely. A British warship was dispatched to collect the family, and the detail that survived the retelling, because it was simply too vivid to let go of, was that the infant prince was carried aboard in a cot improvised from an empty fruit crate. It's difficult to invent a better opening image for the life that followed. A prince, undeniably, but one who spent his first sea voyage packed like produce, while the adults around him argued about thrones and blame. The title always arrived first. The security never quite caught up. The family settled into exile outside Paris in a borrowed house on reduced means, which is one of the stranger tricks royal life can play on outside observers. A person can carry bloodlines running through half of Europe and still be short of cash, a fixed address, and any real stability. Philip grew up surrounded by grand names and uncertain finances in equal measure, which made him worldly very early and practical not long after. Because a child who learns first-hand that rank doesn't pay the household bills, tends to grow up with very little patience for pretension. His early years were a patchwork of languages and shifting relatives, English, French, German, Greek, and Danish family ties, all tangled together, with Mountbatten cousins in Britain on one side and assorted German princelings on the other. He would later joke about the linguistic confusion of his childhood, but the truth sitting underneath the joke was plain enough. Home wasn't a fixed place for him. Home was wherever the most recently obliging relative happened to be putting up with the family that particular season. That rootlessness left a mark. People who knew Philip later would often remark on his force of will, his discipline, and his tendency to treat sentiment as an unnecessary extra cushion, one more soft object liable to slide around and not be trusted. He learned to travel light emotionally as well as physically. He learned not to expect steady devotion from the adults around him. He learned in the plainest possible terms that a boy could be loved and still be left behind. In Paris he attended an American school and was remembered as bright, quick, and rather pleased with the speed of his own mind, a quality that never left him for the rest of his life. He was the sort of person who walked into a room already faintly irritated that the room was moving too slowly to keep up with him. Quick children can be delightful. Quick children without much steady supervision tend to become formidable instead, and Philip was well on his way to becoming exactly that. Then, in the early 1930s, came the collapse that might have broken a softer child entirely. His 4 sisters married into German aristocratic families and scattered across the continent. His father effectively separated from the family and drifted into a wandering existence on the French Riviera, where cards, clubs, and a glamorous companion suited him rather better than the serious business of raising a son. His mother suffered a severe mental health crisis, was diagnosed in terms that read as chillingly clinical by today's standards, and was placed in a Swiss sanatorium. Philip was still a boy when all 3 collapses happened, in close succession, and there's a real difference between losing parents to death and losing them by stages while they remain, inconveniently, still alive somewhere. For several years he was effectively parented by relay, passed between relatives who did their best. His grandmother, Victoria Milford Haven, offered steadiness and good sense. Various Mountbatten cousins pitched in. His uncle, Louis Mountbatten, glamorous and endlessly ambitious, took a particular and lasting interest, a man who could turn ordinary family concern into a full strategic campaign. Mountbatten had charm, vanity, real affection, and an excellent instinct for exactly where history was heading next, all wrapped together in one supremely polished package. Philip admired him, learned from him, and eventually saw through him more clearly than most people ever managed. But for a genuinely lonely boy, attention from a man like that could feel like oxygen, whatever its more complicated undertones. Money was never far from this story either, and this wasn't the fairy tale version of royalty, all gold coaches and bottomless accounts. Philip was a royal exile with excellent connections and no personal fortune whatsoever, which in the marriage economics of European dynasties was not a small detail at all. Wealth doesn't guarantee love, but it does make other people considerably less inventive in their objections, and Philip would go on meeting a great many objections before this particular story was finished. First, though, he had to survive adolescence, and he did it in schools built for exactly the harder side of his temperament. At 13 he spent a year in Germany under the educator Kurt Hahn, a man devoted to character. Endurance, service, and the sort of bracing self-improvement that sounds inspiring coming from a headmaster's mouth and considerably more exhausting when actually lived by a teenage boy. Hahn was Jewish and outspokenly opposed to the moral rot he watched spreading through Germany, and when the Nazi regime rose to power, he was forced out entirely. He relocated to Scotland and founded Gordonstoun. Philip followed him there. If there was ever a school built to take a half-orphaned, restless, physically fearless boy and press him into his most concentrated form, this was it. The regime at Gordonstoun was austere, outdoor, physically punishing, and almost theatrically uninterested in comfort. Cold baths, hard runs, sea air, duty, responsibility. An atmosphere that seemed to suggest character was best cultivated while slightly frozen. Plenty of boys hated every second of it. Philip thrived, and that fact alone says a great deal about him. He wasn't merely tough by nature. He wanted the world around him to be tough too, so that his own toughness would finally have somewhere useful to go. Hardship didn't frighten him. It clarified him. He excelled at games, at field exercises, at taking charge and showing nerve under pressure, and he also picked up a reputation for wit sharp enough to cut, for confidence that could tip over into arrogance, and for a habit of spotting weakness in others without much mercy attached. Those qualities charm a crowd during a crisis and cost a great deal in ordinary private life. In a husband, they can become very expensive indeed. Still, Gordonstoun gave him something genuinely vital, structure, in a life that had until then been entirely composed of fracture. It offered rules that didn't depend on whether some adult relative had simply had enough of Europe that particular season. It rewarded competence rather than birth. And Philip responded to systems like that with real deep enthusiasm whenever he judged them worth respecting. What he never learned, because life had never taught it to him kindly, was how to make himself smaller for someone else's comfort. In 1937, when he was 16, tragedy found him again in a form stark enough to shake even a boy already this well practised in loss. His sister Cecily, whom he adored, was killed in a plane crash along with her husband, 2 of their children, and the unborn baby she was carrying. Philip travelled to the funeral in Germany, and the surviving photographs of that day carry a kind of horrified fascination even now. A young, grief-stricken Philip walking behind the coffins, surrounded by relatives and public figures tied to the Nazi regime his sisters had married into. History has never much cared about tidy moral timing. The boy who would soon fight Britain's war against fascism had to bury his sister inside a setting soaked in exactly the symbols that would come to feel unbearable only a few years later. Families rarely consult decency before becoming complicated. They simply arrive that way, and everyone else spends years pretending to be surprised by it. Cecily's death cut deep. Philip was never a man who processed pain through long, careful conversation. He became, instead, a man who kept moving, and grief has its own filing system. It settles wherever it can find room. People who knew him later often described his emotional method as briskness. And that briskness didn't mean nothing sat underneath it. Usually, it meant there was simply too much. By the end of the decade, he had turned into precisely the kind of young man institutions love discovering. Tall, athletic, good-looking, competent, carrying exactly the bearing that makes an organization feel it has found a natural leader on its own. He entered the Royal Naval College at Dartmouth and graduated as the top cadet of his intake. The Navy suited him for every reason it had first entered his life as rescue. It was disciplined, hierarchical, and international without ever being vague. It measured men by performance under genuine pressure. It never once asked him to explain his childhood. It only asked whether he could do the job. Then, in the summer of 1939, fate arrived in the unglamorous form of 2 young princesses visiting Dartmouth with their parents. Philip was 18. Princess Elizabeth was 13. In a storybook, this would arrive dressed in velvet and moonlight. In real life, it was simpler, and for exactly that reason, considerably more powerful. Philip was asked to help entertain the visiting princesses, and he did, and Elizabeth noticed him immediately, which is hardly surprising, because he was vigorous, golden, self-assured, and entirely unlike the careful, muted world of men she had been raised inside. Court life in that era could be genuinely affectionate behind closed doors, but its public habits were stiff. The future queen was being brought up inside an atmosphere of duty, routine, and formidable parental love wrapped tightly in strict boundaries. Then along came Philip, all long legs and navel-bearing and easy conversation, carrying an ease with the wider world she had never once been permitted to develop for herself. He wasn't decoration for the drawing room. He was, in every practical sense, a door out of it. That first impression mattered enormously, because Elizabeth was never a young woman inclined to change her mind casually once it had settled somewhere. She was shy, observant, and considerably steadier than her younger sister Margaret, but she carried a real romantic streak underneath the reserve. One that expressed itself through loyalty rather than drama. Once she fixed her attention on someone, she rarely let go, and Philip, without particularly planning it, had become important to her. Then the war arrived, which has a habit of making private feeling seem both less urgent and somehow more intense at once. Philip went into active service, first in the Indian Ocean, and then in the Mediterranean, where he saw genuinely serious combat. He was present at the Battle of Cape Matapan and was mentioned in dispatches for his conduct managing a searchlight during a night engagement. In plain terms, he did dangerous work under fire, did it well, and impressed people who weren't in the habit of being easily impressed. He later served as first lieutenant on a destroyer at just 21, remarkably young for that responsibility. The war polished exactly the qualities institutions admire most in a man: stamina, judgment, decisive command, and a total willingness to simply get on with the job in front of him. It also complicated his position socially in ways that would follow him for the rest of his life. Here was a man serving Britain with genuine distinction while several of his brothers-in-law fought on the German side. Here was a royal prince of Greece and Denmark, descended from Queen Victoria, effectively British by education and service, but never neatly, straightforwardly British in the way the palace preferred its future sons-in-law to be. Here was a young naval officer with extraordinary looks and pedigree, but no money, no stable national identity in the public imagination, and a family tree that by the 1940s had become, quite literally, a diplomatic headache wearing formal dress. For Elizabeth, none of these complications mattered as much as character did. She saw, as many women eventually see well before the world grants them permission to say it aloud, that beneath the confidence and the alarming frankness sat a man who had genuinely made himself, not from nothing exactly, since royalty is never quite nothing, but from wreckage, improvisation, and sheer personal effort. He was alive in a way that sheltered people so often find irresistible. He'd been tested repeatedly, and he had survived every single time. He didn't float through life on ceremonial cushions. He strode straight through it and expected everyone else to keep up the pace. They corresponded throughout the remaining war years, letters passing back and forth between the young princess and the naval officer. And the age gap that had looked considerable at Dartmouth narrowed steadily as she grew older and he matured into a decorated, capable man. Courtship at that particular altitude was never simply about two hearts finding each other. It involved dynasty, religion, nationality, money, etiquette, family approval, and that most quintessentially British of anxieties, whether the person in question would actually fit. Philip was a great many admirable things, Easy to fit was never one of them, and that turned out to be part of the attraction rather than a strike against it. The men circling Elizabeth had titles, manners, and thoroughly suitable backgrounds. Philip had force. He had the unsettling gift of making any room feel less upholstered and considerably more real. He'd spent years being shuffled about like excess luggage, and had, in response, turned himself into someone nobody could ever casually misplace again. By war's end, he was no longer merely the handsome naval cousin who'd once made a girl laugh at Dartmouth. He was a serious contender for her heart, and, very soon, whether the palace liked the idea or not, for her hand as well. The trouble was that marrying Philip wouldn't simply mean adding a pleasant husband to an already stable royal household. It would mean bringing into the House of Windsor a man forged by exile, abandonment, discipline, loss, foreignness, and a genuine, deep-seated dislike of fools. In public, he looked exactly like the sort of prince a monarchy should be pleased to order for itself. In private, he was precisely the sort a monarchy would struggle mightily to contain. Elizabeth, calm where he ran restless, dutiful where he ran volcanic, had already worked out that this contrast wasn't a flaw in the plan. It was the entire point. And that, of course, was also the problem. A future queen wasn't supposed to fall in love as though she were merely an ordinary young woman with functioning eyes and a pulse. She was expected to weigh the Constitution, the Commonwealth, the Church, public sentiment, the newspapers, her family, and the opinions of elderly men who had never once had to choose a husband while carrying an empire on their own shoulders. Elizabeth did weigh all of it, because she weighed everything, and arrived at the identical conclusion every single time. She wanted Philip. The men surrounding her were considerably less serene about it. Some admired him outright. Others were wary, and courtiers, faced with any newcomer carrying genuine force of personality, tend to notice the disruption first. He seemed too foreign to some tastes, too blunt for others, too poor by the strict calculations of royal marriage, and too closely surrounded by relatives in German uniforms for the comfort of a court that had only just finished a war against Germany. The royal family itself had spent decades carefully emphasizing its own Britishness, having changed its name during the First World War from the unmistakably Germanic Saxe-Coburg-Gotha to the sturdier, considerably less alarming Windsor. Into the middle of this carefully managed British pageant walked Prince Philip of Greece and Denmark, nephew and cousin to roughly half of Europe, sisters married into German princely houses, a mother in fragile recovery, a father living an entirely separate life, and an uncle named Mountbatten who approached the whole courtship rather like a military campaign. Louis Mountbatten didn't merely support the match. He actively cultivated it with the enthusiasm of a man who genuinely enjoyed arranging history from the more comfortable side of the curtain. He loved influence the way some people love sunshine, and he also, in his own tangled Mountbatten fashion, where affection, pride, ambition, and self-promotion always seemed to arrive bundled together, genuinely cared for his nephew. He saw immediately that Philip could make a magnificent royal husband if only the palace could be talked out of fainting. King George VI did not faint. He worried, being a cautious and dutiful man who had never expected to wear the crown, and who understood, better than most, exactly how fragile a monarchy could be. He loved his elder daughter deeply and wanted her safe, happy, and appropriately married, though not necessarily always in that order of priority. He also knew she was still very young. Once Philip became a more open presence around the family after the war, the king allowed the friendship room to develop, but preferred not to rush toward any formal engagement. That caution was wise. It was also, in the end, entirely futile. Delay can slow events down considerably. It rarely changes what the heart has already decided. By 1946, Philip understood that he was no longer simply visiting a pleasant family with 2 princesses and excellent household staff. He was in love with Elizabeth, and she with him. That summer, first at Balmoral and then at Osborne, the relationship deepened into something that could no longer be waved away as youthful admiration. He proposed privately. She accepted privately, entirely in character for both of them, since he was never a man built for decorative hesitation, and she was never a woman inclined to say yes simply for the entertainment of it. The King and Queen were informed. The Queen Mother had real reservations, being fiercely protective of Elizabeth and status-conscious enough that she wasn't instantly charmed by a prospective son-in-law who arrived with cheekbones, real charm, and considerably too much of his own opinion. One can hardly blame her caution. Philip didn't drift into rooms murmuring gratitude. He arrived carrying opinions and very little money besides, which in a court setting has a way of making people suddenly moralistic about matters they'd never think twice about around genuine fortune. Love may be poetic. Household budgets never are. The king, sympathetic despite his adviser's misgivings, wanted the formal announcement delayed until Elizabeth turned 21. Philip agreed, having little real choice in the matter, but also enough sense to know the battle would go easier if he didn't begin it by kicking over the furniture. There was also a separate, less romantic and more surgical matter to attend to. If Philip was going to marry the heir presumptive, he needed to become acceptable in strict constitutional and public terms. And so he did what he had been doing his entire life. He reshaped himself to survive. He renounced his Greek and Danish royal titles. He became a naturalized British subject. He adopted the surname Mountbatten, the anglicised version of Battenberg used by his mother's family. It was a practical move and not remotely a cost-free one. Names inside royal families are never merely names. Their claims, loyalties, inheritances, and occasionally small explosions waiting to happen. Philip had spent his entire life being rearranged by circumstances outside his control. Now, for the first time, he rearranged himself deliberately in order to marry. Just before the wedding, he was created Duke of Edinburgh, Earl of Merioneth, and Baron Greenwich. On paper, the transformation looked administratively tidy. Humanly, it was considerably messier. He had traded one set of identities for entry into a family that still didn't entirely trust him, walking straight into the centre of British monarchy while remaining, in subtle ways, permanently an outsider. That particular tension never fully disappeared for the rest of his life. The engagement was announced in July 1947, and the public adored the romance instantly. Britain, exhausted by war, rationing, grief and endless queuing, welcomed the glamour and the faint suggestion that history might finally behave itself for once. Naturally, history declined the invitation. Elizabeth famously saved ration coupons to help pay for the fabric of her wedding dress. A small detail the public appreciated precisely because it suggested even a princess couldn't simply float above post-war reality on a cloud of magically summoned silk. Behind the pageantry, Philip's own family situation carried real shadows. His mother, Princess Alice, attended the wedding wearing the severe dignity of someone who had passed through genuine catastrophe and emerged with an entirely different understanding of life. She had by then embraced a religious vocation and looked less like a European princess than a figure stepped out of an icon. His father attended too. Though the marriage between Philip's parents had long since failed in any ordinary sense, so the family unity on display that day was ceremonial rather than lived. His sisters weren't invited at all, their German connections judged too politically awkward so soon after the war. Consider the plain message of that absence. On the single most public day of his life. Several members of his own family were simply too inconvenient to appear. Philip understood inconvenient family better than almost anyone alive. Understanding never made it pleasant. On the 20th of November 1947, in Westminster Abbey, he married Princess Elizabeth. He was 26. She was 21. The ceremony was magnificent. Because royal weddings are built for magnificence the way ships are built for water, but at its centre stood two people of sharply different temperament, making promises neither could fully anticipate, keeping under the conditions soon to arrive. They spent part of the honeymoon at Broadlands, the Mountbatten estate, which suited Uncle Dickie enormously, and part at Berkeley in Scotland. What followed is often remembered by people who prefer their marriage stories tidy as a simple period of uncomplicated early happiness. They were happy. They were also, without quite realizing it yet, beginning one of the more lopsided domestic arrangements in modern history. At first, there was still room for ordinary married pleasures. Philip continued his naval career, and Elizabeth, not yet queen, could still be something close to an officer's wife, if an officer's wife with a great many more tiaras and considerably fewer chances to quietly slide a casserole into the oven. They lived for stretches at Clarence House and later in Malta, when Philip was posted there, and Malta mattered enormously to both of them. It offered a taste of ordinary life, which for this particular couple meant only the slightest tinge of absurdity around the edges. They could dine with friends, drive about with far less scrutiny than at home, and live a version of marriage not yet entirely consumed by the machinery of monarchy. Those Malta years were, by most accounts, among the happiest of Philip's entire life. Quite possibly because they let him become the one thing he had genuinely fought his whole youth to become: a real naval officer with a real career ahead of him. He was good at it. More than good. Ambitious, able, and respected. Understanding ships and men and systems, and thoroughly enjoying the particular pleasure of functioning inside a meritocratic hierarchy where competence mattered more than inherited rank. In the Navy, he wasn't an ornamental husband trailing behind a more important wife. He was simply himself. The sea had rescued him as an infant, given him a genuine profession as a young man, and was now offering him a natural life. That life was about to be taken from him, politely, constitutionally, and permanently. Their first child, Charles, was born in November 1948. Their second, Anne, followed in August 1950. Parenthood ought to have softened Philip into some gentler public expectation. It didn't entirely. He loved his children, but had very little patience for sentimental performance around fatherhood. Babies don't salute, and the palace nursery bore no resemblance to a naval bridge. He remained young, energetic, and proud of his wife and growing family, while still determined not to vanish quietly into decorative husbandhood. He wanted responsibility, authority, and forward motion, not the gentle fading away that fatherhood seems to invite in some men. Then, on the 6th of February 1952, King George VI died in his sleep at Sandringham, while Elizabeth and Philip were on tour in Kenya, and in that single instant the ordinary years of their marriage effectively ended. His wife was no longer merely the young woman who loved him with quiet certainty. She was the queen, and he, almost before he could absorb the blow either as son-in-law or husband, became consort to the sovereign, a role for which no amount of naval training could properly prepare a man who despised standing still. For Elizabeth, the moment demanded duty accepted with a composure that could make onlookers believe nobility was simply a natural condition rather than a private shock. For Philip, it was loss arriving in full-dress uniform. His father-in-law was dead. His wife had crossed an invisible line into monarchy that could never be uncrossed. His own imagined future ended before lunch. He grasped that faster than almost anyone around him, because Elizabeth had spent her entire life being trained for eventual queenship. The timing was cruel, but the destination had never really been in doubt. Philip had married the heir presumptive and surely understood, in the abstract, what might one day happen. Abstract knowledge turns out to be a very flimsy umbrella in a natural storm. In practice, he had still been a serving naval officer, with real promotion ahead of him, work that genuinely mattered to him, and a marriage whose domestic balance, uneven as it already was, still left room for ordinary companionship. Now he was expected to surrender command, ambition, most of his independence, and the private authority husbands typically enjoy, all in service to a woman he loved and an institution that still regarded him as a faintly suspect newcomer with excellent cheekbones. There was no comforting precedent to draw on. Britain understood what a queen was. It understood, dimly, what a prince consort had been back in Victoria's day. It had no real idea what to do with Philip, who was never the kind of man content to stand beside a throne, smiling supportively while quietly fading into tasteful insignificance. He carried too much energy, intelligence, and opinion for decorative extinction, and the palace, quite reasonably, suspected all three at once. On the flight home from Kenya, he is said to have focused, as he so often did under strain, on practical matters. And there's something genuinely revealing in that detail. Where other people weep or drift, Philip reached instinctively for the next necessary task. Grief could wait. Function came first. That instinct made him invaluable during genuine crisis and often exhausting during ordinary life, and it meant that while Elizabeth absorbed the twin blows of her father's death and the crown's full weight, Philip was already confronting the brutal arithmetic of his new position. He would have to resign his naval commission. He would have to live wherever the sovereign lived. He would have to serve without ever commanding. For a man who loved engines, speed, and measurable results, court life threatened to become a very elegant form of suffocation. The family name dispute that followed captured this diminishment more sharply than anything else could. An ordinary husband expects, without even having to think about it, that his children will carry his name. In monarchy, that expectation first has to be beaten into submission with a constitutional stick. The royal house remained Windsor, a decision shaped by politics, continuity, and the combined influence of the Queen Mother and Prime Minister Winston Churchill. Philip felt the insult keenly, reportedly complaining that he was the only man in the country not permitted to give his own name to his own children. Even setting aside the exact wording, the grievance is easy enough to understand. He had already surrendered titles, nationality, and most of his independent future. Now even the simplest ordinary dignity of fatherhood, passing down a name, was denied him too. It was a deeply personal humiliation delivered in the coldest possible official language, and it touched the oldest wound in his entire life, belonging. Philip had grown up half displaced and half adopted by a rotating cast of relatives, forever caught between worlds. To be told, in effect, that he would serve at the very centre of British monarchy without ever setting its name was to be reminded once again that incorporation and true acceptance were not remotely the same thing. People sometimes wondered why he could be so difficult. Difficulty, more often than not, begins exactly where dignity has been repeatedly bruised. As preparations gathered pace for the 1953 coronation, the new royal household turned into a workshop of tension and quiet reinvention. Elizabeth threw herself into duty with the same disciplined calm that would define her entire reign. Philip, denied the conventional public role that might have satisfied his ambitions elsewhere, began hunting for places where he could actually shape the future. He pushed hard for televising the coronation, an idea plenty of older advisers hated on principle, fearing television would cheapen sacred mystery and let the public press in far too close. Philip saw exactly the opposite. He understood that refusing the camera would only make the monarchy look dusty and remote in an age already changing faster than its own uniforms. His instincts here were modern well before the institution around him was ready to admit it needed modernizing at all. Televising the coronation wasn't a trivial technical choice. It was a decision about how monarchy would survive inside the age of mass domestic media, and Philip pushed for it because he understood, better than the old guard did, that relevance can't be preserved by hiding. On the 2nd of June 1953, Philip knelt before Elizabeth and paid formal homage, a husband publicly promising loyalty to his own wife as sovereign, before the entire nation and much of the watching world. It looks simple enough in ceremonial language and reads as something considerably more volcanic beneath the surface. Few men of his particular temperament could have managed that symbolism without real inner strain, and Philip managed it outwardly with total discipline. That alone deserves real credit. The years that followed settled into a pattern that would define the marriage for decades. He would push, provoke, reform, flee into activity, and then return. She would absorb, consult, sometimes yield, and sometimes stand entirely immovable, holding both the institution and the marriage together against considerable pressure from every direction. This wasn't a sentimental partnership in any conventional sense. It was a working alliance built on love, real attraction, real irritation, and an extraordinary degree of mutual dependence. Philip offered Elizabeth something almost nobody else in her orbit dared to: honesty without flattery. He would tell her plainly when a speech was dull, a plan was foolish, or a person in the room was being ridiculous, and that candour was invaluable inside a world specifically designed to cushion sovereigns from unwelcome truth. In return, she gave him the one thing Exile had denied him for most of his life: a fixed centre. Not peace exactly, since peace was never Philip's native condition, but somewhere to belong without qualification, even when the institutions surrounding them made belonging feel bureaucratic and conditional. Denied a conventional outlet for his ambitions, Philip built himself entirely new ones. In the mid-1950s, he became the driving force behind what became the Duke of Edinburgh's award, built on the simple, durable idea that young people should be challenged to attempt difficult things, serve others, build real skills, and discover in themselves that they could manage more than comfort alone ever demanded of them. The idea didn't come from theory dreamed up over sherry by people who had never once carried a pack up a hillside. It came directly out of Philip's own childhood and his genuine belief that character is built under real pressure, and for a man so often painted as cold, it represented an unusually practical faith in ordinary human potential. He championed conservation with the same restless energy, taking a leading role in the World Wildlife Fund and dragging public attention toward environmental decline long before it became fashionable dinner conversation. Approaching the natural world not as a dreamy spectator, but as a practical strategist alarmed by what human carelessness was doing to it. At home, meanwhile, the same impatience that let him cut cleanly through ceremonial nonsense could make ordinary domestic life feel like an exam nobody had warned you to study for. His parenting revealed his sharpest edges, particularly with his eldest son. Charles grew into a thoughtful, imaginative, and rather shy young man drawn to music and reading and solitude, everything Philip's own hard-won survival instincts had trained him to distrust. Philip looked at that sensitivity and saw vulnerability rather than a different, equally valid kind of strength, and so, when the question of Charles's schooling arose, he pushed the boy toward Gordonstoun, the very institution that had once forged Philip out of a wounded, furious teenager. To Philip this was serious fatherly responsibility. To Charles it often felt like exile inside a damp moral experiment, and he suffered there, homesick and unhappy in ways his father, hearing complaint, tended to read as simple resistance to necessary growth. Anne, by contrast, met her father on ground he recognized instinctively. She was plain-spoken, tough, and unimpressed by fuss, and their bond had an ease that never quite materialized with Charles. This was one of the genuine tragedies sitting inside the House of Windsor, not a shortage of feeling on either side, but two people whose feelings arrived in incompatible languages. Philip loved through pressure. Charles needed love that felt like refuge, and each mistook the other's approach for rejection for years afterward. Tragedy struck the wider family again in August 1979, when Lord Mountbatten was killed by an Ira bomb while on holiday in Ireland, along with his grandson and a local boy, and Mountbatten's daughter, left gravely injured. For Philip the loss was personal almost beyond measuring. Mountbatten had been uncle, mentor, architect, and irritant all at once, and one doesn't lose a figure like that tidily. Charles, too, had loved and relied on his great-uncle deeply, and the grief following Mountbatten's death fed directly into a new urgency around Charles's own long-delayed marriage. Philip, weary of drift and increasingly direct about it, urged his son toward decision, writing to him in terms that were paternal, forceful, and morally clear: either let the young woman in question go, or marry her. But stop dithering in a way that damaged her reputation. There was real fairness buried in that advice. There was also real danger, because turning emotional uncertainty into a strict deadline rarely produces a marriage built to last. Diana Spencer arrived looking, on paper, like the perfect solution to every dynastic anxiety at once, which is usually the surest sign that trouble is already on its way. Young, aristocratic, English, and seemingly untouched by complication. She solved the institution's immediate problem without anyone pausing long enough to ask whether she and Charles genuinely suited each other. The wedding in July 1981 became a moment of national delirium. Lace and youth and glamour offered up almost gratefully to a country then trudging through recession and industrial unrest. From his position as father of the groom, Philip, a veteran of dynastic compromise himself, must have recognized both the triumph and the fragility on display in equal measure. He knew spectacle when he saw it. He also knew perfectly well that marriage doesn't grow easier simply because millions of people admire the veil. The marriage cracked under exactly the pressures anyone paying close attention might have predicted: incompatible expectations, unresolved earlier attachments, and a level of public obsession that made private failure almost impossible to manage quietly. Philip's own relationship with Diana was more layered than either his critics or his admirers generally allow. He could be genuinely sympathetic to her distress, understanding firsthand how brutal the royal environment could be for outsiders never properly prepared for its particular emotional weather. He wrote to her during the marriage's slow collapse, offering advice that was stern, sensible, occasionally kind, and unmistakably his own. What he could never quite manage was accommodating a style of suffering that spilled directly into public view and demanded to be seen. Diana didn't conceal pain in the old royal manner. She transmitted it, and the public felt it right alongside her, which Philip, formed by an older code of enduring quietly and carrying on regardless, found genuinely difficult to process. Even as he was sharp enough to sense the world shifting decisively around him. The early 1990s delivered a full reckoning all at once. Charles and Diana separated and eventually divorced. Andrew and Sarah Ferguson separated. Anne's own marriage to Mark Phillips broke down as well. Then, in November 1992, fire tore through Windsor Castle itself, damaging more than 100 rooms in one of the monarchy's most central physical symbols, in a coincidence almost too grim to seem accidental. The Queen would call it her annus horribilis, and nobody who had watched the year unfold could accuse her of exaggerating. For Philip, the year exposed the genuine limits of the creed that had shaped his entire life. Discipline could steady a person. It couldn't guarantee happiness. Duty could preserve an institution. It couldn't teach two fundamentally unsuited people to love each other properly. Then came August 1997, and Diana's death in a Paris car crash which struck the entire country like a physical blow to the chest. Grief curdled almost instantly into public accusation, aimed squarely at the press and just as sharply at what looked from the outside like royal silence and indifference. In those first crucial days at Balmoral, while the country raged, Philip and Elizabeth focused entirely on William and Harry, an instinct rooted less in public relations strategy than in old habits of protection. Philip was central to those days, walking with the boys, talking with them, offering the same practical, structured presence he had always offered best, because he understood, from bitter personal experience, exactly how grief can freeze around a child if nobody helps keep it moving. The most haunting moment of his entire public life may well have come at the funeral itself, when he chose to walk alongside William and Harry behind their mother's coffin through the streets of London. An almost unbearable demand to place on a 15-year-old and a 12-year-old. Philip put himself directly into that line of sorrow and public spectacle and walked beside them, a grandfather sharing the same unforgiving gaze, helping make the unbearable just barely possible to endure. It didn't erase every later tension with Harry, and it didn't repair the family's grief. But in a life so often criticized for emotional clumsiness, Philip chose, in that single moment, the hardest available form of loyalty, and he stood inside it without flinching. Age never softened him into harmless background scenery. He remained industrious and sharp-tongued well into his 90s, continuing his charity work and his environmental campaigning and his habit of asking the one question everyone else in the room had hoped the schedule would quietly avoid. By 2017, when he retired from public duties at the age of 96, he had completed more than 22,000 solo engagements across 7 decades in an entirely unprecedented job description: husband to the sovereign, holding no constitutional power and no realistic possibility of ordinary escape. He died on the 9th of April 2021 at Windsor Castle, 2 months shy of his 100th birthday, and the abiding image from his final years wasn't grandeur at all, but simple companionship, 2 very old people spending the long pandemic lockdown together at Windsor, an elderly husband and wife finally granted the ordinary private stretches that 70 years of monarchy had rarely allowed them. Assessments of him have divided along entirely predictable lines ever since. To some he represents stale masculinity, tactlessness, and the emotional illiteracy of a world that told boys to swallow pain and call the swallowing strength. To others he represents the monarchy's great realist, the man who saw the future arriving early, worked harder than nearly anyone around him, and gave the institution movement and grit precisely when it needed both most. Both portraits carry real truth. Neither one is sufficient by itself. He was a child of shattered courts who turned his own instability into discipline. He was a naval officer who lost the career he loved because his wife inherited a throne neither of them had chosen. He was a father who wanted to toughen his children and sometimes wounded them instead. He was a husband who could exasperate, offend, or vanish into work at exactly the wrong moment. He was also the man who walked behind Diana's coffin beside two grieving boys, the man who told the Queen the truth when everyone else wrapped it in soft tissue, the man who dragged an ancient institution toward the modern world even when the modern world plainly annoyed him. Perhaps that's the simplest way to finally understand him. Philip was never built to be easy. Ease was never his native language. He trusted action over confession, competence over charm, endurance over display, having lived far too early with exile, abandonment, and lost to ever become a soft man. But he lived long enough, too, to turn those hard early lessons into service on an almost unimaginable scale. He sharpened the monarchy because he genuinely couldn't bear dead air sitting inside it. He sharpened the people closest to him for exactly the same reason, which is why some adored him, some feared him, and some simply needed a very quiet room after dinner to recover. Elizabeth chose him when she was still young, and she did not choose badly. She chose a man who would challenge the institution she had to embody her entire life, animate the existence she had to endure, and never once let her drift into the narcotic fog that can settle over sovereigns left too long unchallenged. He was difficult. Yes, he was at times genuinely impossible. But he was never merely ornamental, and he was never for a single day of his 100 years dull.